We've talked about European exploration in general. Now we're going to focus specifically on the English exploration and settlement of North America. And that brings us to the first colony, namely Virginia. It's referred to as the Chesapeake because the two colonies around Chesapeake Bay, Virginia and Maryland, are often referred to by that name. The question is not only why did the English colonize this area, but why then? What was different at that time in history? That time being 1607 when they settled Jamestown, which became Virginia. Now, before 1588, Spain's navy was stronger. And it was very important to have control of the seas in order to not only to found a colony, but to maintain it. Once you start a colony, you have to have ships going there to bring more people, to bring supplies. You have ships then returning with the crops or products that the colony produces. You had to have a constant stream of traffic back and forth. And with Spain's navy being in a stronger position in the Atlantic Ocean, that was difficult to do. But then something very important happens in 1588, and that is the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Also, in England in the 16th century, there was a lot of religious conflict. This was the time of the English Reformation. You're probably familiar with King Henry VIII breaking away from the Catholic Church at Rome and founding the Church of England. This was another thing in the previous century that made it difficult for England to focus on colonizing other parts of the world. Remember, a colony is when you control another part of the world for your own economic gain. There's another factor that goes on here. Now that the Spanish Armada has been defeated in 1588 and that the religious turmoil has calmed down some, there is a growing overpopulation in England, and they're looking for a place to siphon off, a place to send some of their extra people. And a colony could provide that. There was also a growing economic prosperity in England and a desire for more raw materials and new markets, new places to sell the things that you could produce. And that also plays in perfectly with the desire to found colonies. Now, there was also the goal of finding an all-water route to East Asia. Now, you could do this by going down around the southern tip of Africa, but that was a very long way. They didn't have any idea of how large the world was, and so they thought that the Pacific Ocean was actually a lot smaller than it is, and they thought, well, maybe if we go to the north, we can get there more quickly. It'd be better than going around the tip of Africa, and it would be better than going around the tip of South America. So if we could find a shortcut through North America to the Pacific, then maybe we could get an advantage in trade. The problem was that this shortcut didn't exist, but they didn't know that. And they also wanted bases in North America from which to attack Spanish ships, Spanish colonies, and compete with them. They remain the bitter enemy of Spain during this whole period. Okay, so this is part of the background of English colonization of Virginia. Now, at this point, we should look at the three different types, really four different types of colonies when they were founded. There were charter colonies like Virginia. That means the king issued a charter. That's a piece of paper giving someone, a company in this case, the right to do something. A joint stock company is an old-fashioned term for what we would call a corporation. It's a large business. And they gave a charter to a group called the Virginia Company of London. So that was a way that private investors could pick up the cost of founding and maintaining a colony, but the English crown, the king, would still be able to skim off some of the profits from it. It was like a way of trying to get the best of both worlds. So they gave the right to run Virginia to the Virginia Company of London. They were a for-profit company intending to make some sort of profit from the colony of Virginia. Virginia, by the way, is named after the Virgin Queen, that one of the nicknames of Queen Elizabeth I, who had died in 1603. Jamestown, by the way, is named after King James I, the King of England, who took over from Elizabeth. The second type of colony is a compact colony. An example will be Plymouth, the colony that we'll look at next, in which the people themselves agree to form a government. This is a deal they work out among themselves with the approval of the English king, but mostly this is an effort that they do by themselves. The third type of colony is called a proprietary colony. A proprietor is somebody who runs something. And an example of this would be Maryland. We'll talk about Maryland a little bit more later, but the King of England gave the Calvert family the right to run Maryland. They were proprietors of Maryland. Okay, now eventually these systems did not work too well, and eventually all of the colonies became royal colonies. That's the fourth type. And that meant that they were governed directly under the control of the king. Okay. And Virginia itself was the first company to be made a royal colony, first colony to become a royal colony, and that happened in 1624. Now this is a map of Chesapeake Bay. You'll notice here that Jamestown was founded on an island on the James River, and it was a little bit off of the Atlantic coast to try to conceal it a bit and make it more distant and more difficult for Spanish ships to raid it. And that's why it was not right on the coast. This was not a very good location, they found out later. It was damp, mosquito-infested, really not the best place to start a colony, but that's where they did start it. And this was 1607. That's a very important date. The first permanent English colony in North America began at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Okay, the first settlers who came, there were 105 of them who arrived, and all of them were men. That should tell us something. It should tell us that they didn't have any clear plans for a permanent colony that would reproduce itself. The mentality here was to get rich quick. They had unbelievably unrealistic expectations. They thought, well, we're going to find gold like the Spanish had found in some areas, and we're not even going to have to do the work. The Native Americans are going to do it for us. And then we will, just stock up our ships with gold, and take them back to England and live the rest of our lives in luxury. Well, this was absurdly unrealistic. There is no gold in Virginia. And they also didn't bother to learn very much about farming, which would have been a good idea because they had to eat. The first winter was very difficult, and only 38 of the 105 settlers survived that first winter. They had thought, again, that they would extract gold and silver, but that was a complete failure. Now, the key that makes Virginia work is tobacco. So I'm going to divide this presentation into two parts here: Virginia before tobacco and Virginia after they discovered how to grow tobacco, with the assistance of Native Americans, by the way. The area was controlled by a Native American leader by the name of Powhatan. In 1608, Captain John Smith arrived and took command. Had some health issues, had to leave, fairly shortly after that. But he was a strong leader, and he managed to put some order into Jamestown. But then in the winter of 1609 and 1610, they referred to that as the starving time. They resorted to cannibalism in order to try to survive. And at this point, conflict began with the Indians. And the basic reason for this is that they were stealing their food, and they were taking their land. I mean, those are the two big issues. They were taking food and taking land from Native Americans. And they got resistance, as you might expect they would. And this conflict lasted a long time. Now, as a result of this desperately difficult time, called the starving time, a new commander, a new leader showed up by the name of Captain Thomas Dale in 1611. And he put some new laws in place, known as Dale's Laws. Let's take a look at those. If you murmured, that's just an old-fashioned word for complaining. If you complained, you resisted, or you disobeyed, the penalty for the first offense was whipping, which was a big deal. For the second offense, 3 years in prison. And then 3 strikes and you're out. The third offense, the death penalty. Now, to steal from Indians or to commit violence against them was punishable by death. First offense, right away. Now, is this, would you guess, out of concern for the welfare of Native Americans? No, it was not. It was out of concern for what would happen to you if you committed violence against them or stole from them. So this was a desperate effort to protect their own colony. If you dumped dirty wash water within 20 feet of a well, the penalty was whipping. And we can imagine what led to this. They were pouring basically human waste into a river upstream from where the drinking water was being taken from, or was feeding upstream or near a well. And of course, this resulted in disease and death from disease. So these penalties were extremely harsh. Stealing food from anyone, in fact, not just from Indians, resulted in the death penalty. These are very, very harsh laws. But the reason for them is pretty clear. this colony was in danger of simply going out of existence. So Dale's laws were intended to create more order and to allow the colony simply to survive. The downside, though, is that who would want to come to Virginia? Who would want to go into this dangerous, disease-ridden environment for very little reward, no guarantee of anything good coming from it? So, you can pass these harsh laws, but it's not going to be easy to convince people to come when they had to come voluntarily. They would put out what amounted to travel posters. Look at this. Look at all you can gain by coming to Virginia. This one is in 1609. Excellent fruits by planting in Virginia, exciting all such as be well affected to further the same. What looks like an F there is an S in the way they wrote it then at the beginning of a word. This was not terribly successful. The colony limped along until the key discovery came in 1612, and that was how to grow tobacco, because tobacco was an enormously desirable product in England and in Europe. John Rolfe, who got married to Pocahontas, the daughter of Powhatan, the local chief, she helped him to learn how to grow a superior type of tobacco. As a result, they now had a reason why Virginia could exist. Tobacco was incredibly profitable, but it also created an enormous demand for labor. It's what is called labor intensive. That means you can gain a lot from it, but it takes a tremendous amount of physical labor to achieve that. One worker, though, could produce 100 times the cost of his labor every year. So what it would cost to feed and clothe one worker could result in 100 times that much value going to the landowner who could grow and sell the tobacco. The worker isn't getting that profit, the landowners are. Look at tobacco production. If you wonder, how much it grew, whether it was really a big deal in Virginia, here's some evidence. In 1616, 2,500 pounds. 2 years later, it was 50,000 pounds. By 1640, it was 3 million pounds of tobacco. And by 1688, 28 million pounds. By 1771, on the eve of the American Revolution, 105 million pounds of tobacco came out of this area. That should be all we need to see to realize what a big deal tobacco was. A lot of people think of cotton as the biggest crop in the South. It was. It became that after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, but not yet. In the earlier period, in the colonial period, the biggest news was tobacco in the Chesapeake, Virginia, Maryland, and actually rice in South Carolina. And in the Caribbean, the islands of the Caribbean, the biggest product was sugar. Now, they had to get workers, and the deal that was worked out was called Indentured Servitude. The company, the Virginia Company of London, offered something called a head right to any landowner who could bring over a worker, a servant, or somebody to work. The company would give that landowner another 50 acres of land. That's a good deal. So they were extremely anxious to get more workers so they could get more land and grow more tobacco and get rich or richer. Now, an indenture is a contract. It's just an old-fashioned term for contract. In this case, it means a labor contract. Here's a picture of one. Now, the contract worked something like this, that ship captains would recruit workers, maybe in the inns of England or Ireland. Sometimes you'd have a little bit too much to drink, and the next morning you'd find yourself on a ship headed for Virginia. Often people consented to this. They agreed that they would go to Virginia to work for a certain number of years. The work that they promised to do was in exchange for their ride to Virginia, their passage to Virginia. These are people who are usually desperately poor. They couldn't possibly pay the cost of traveling there by themselves, so they offered several years of their labor in order to get there. But 2/3 of them died before even finishing their terms of service. Now, how long were the terms of service? It varied. It was worked out on an individual basis. It could be 4 years if you're young and healthy and could probably do a lot of good work. It would be a little shorter, or it could be 7 years or 9 years if you weren't that promising as a potential worker. So you would commit to working these periods where you would be under the control of your master, the person who had bought your indenture or your contract. Because conditions in early Virginia were so unhealthy, the majority of those who came there as indentured servants died before their term of service expired. If you were lucky enough to make it through, you would get what is called freedom dues. It could be a small amount of land, it could be a farm animal, it could be some farm tools, things like that. And this was a motivation, an incentive to finish your term of labor, because if you ran away, you would lose your freedom dues. Now, as more and more land was occupied for the growth of tobacco, this land encroached on Indian lands, and that led to wars. The most dramatic one in early Virginia was in 1622. 300 English were killed in one day. That was 25% of the total number. 2 years later, and seeing how badly the company, the Virginia company, was running things, the Crown, in this case James I, ordered that it become a royal colony, and it took over from the Virginia Company of London. In 1644, there were 500 English killed in a war with Native Americans. Actually, even worse than the one in 1622. Now, why the wars? Well, two big reasons. One is the settlers were taking land that the Native Americans had lived on, and secondly, they were stealing food. Now, the consequences of this, well, they weren't good for Native Americans. They were constantly being pushed farther and farther westward. Their numbers declined dramatically, and basically the English eventually gained full control of the colony of Virginia. Now, just a few words on Maryland. The Calvert family, and there's Cecilius Calvert right there, was owed a lot of money by the king. The king owed the Calvert family. Calvert had the title Lord Baltimore, as where we get, of course, the city of Baltimore, Maryland today. This family was different from most English. They were Catholic, and by that time the clearly dominant religion of England was the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Catholics were treated badly in England, and they wanted a colony as a safe haven for Catholics. And the king said to the Calvert family, okay, I'll give you some land that you can use, and you can have your safe haven, and you can have some land that you can use to grow tobacco, if you will cancel the debt that I owe you. Just write it off, and that will be my payment to you for the debt. And that's the deal that was made. And just like Virginia, tobacco was at the center of Maryland's economy. And like Virginia, they used indentured servants. And then later on, this will be a subject for another presentation, they used African slaves. But not so much yet. That's a very important story in its own right, why the transition was made from indentured servitude to African slavery as the dominant labor system of the Chesapeake.